You're a Roman soldier stationed on the eastern frontier. It's dawn. You hear it before you see it. A sound like distant thunder, but the sky is clear. Then you realize it's not thunder, it's hooves. Thousands of them. The ground begins to shake. Your hands tremble as you grip your spear. You've heard the stories. Stories your commanders told you were exaggerated to scare recruits. Stories about warriors who drink the blood of their enemies. About a warlord who eats off wooden plates while his victims' gold melts in the fires of their burning cities. Then you see them cresting the hill. Faces you'll never forget. Skulls deliberately deformed into alien shapes. Eyes that have seen things you can't imagine. And leading them, a man so ordinary-looking you almost laugh until you see what's in his eyes. You're about to meet Attila the Hun, and you have about 4 minutes to live. In the year 452 AD, the city of Aqua was one of the wealthiest and most fortified cities in the Roman Empire. Its walls were considered impregnable. Its citizens felt safe. They were wrong. When Attila's army arrived, the siege lasted 3 months. But it wasn't the siege that broke them. It was what happened after. When the walls finally fell, Attila gave an order that would echo through history. He didn't just want the city conquered. He wanted it erased. Every building was to be demolished stone by stone. Every citizen was to be killed or enslaved. Every trace of Aquileia's existence was to be wiped from the earth. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. He succeeded. Aqua was so completely destroyed that for centuries afterward, travelers passing through the area couldn't even tell a city had once stood there. The survivors, the lucky ones who escaped, fled into the marshes and founded a new settlement on the water, where horsemen couldn't follow them. That settlement would eventually become Venice. Think about that. One of the world's most beautiful cities exists because people were so terrified of one man that they literally fled into a swamp and decided to build their entire civilization on stilts rather than risk encountering him again. This is the story of how one human being became the living embodiment of apocalypse, how a name became synonymous with the end of the world, how a Hun earned the title that would haunt history forever. Fleelam Day, the Scourge of God. And I need to warn you, this story gets dark, really dark, because to understand Attila's power, you have to understand the things he did, and more disturbingly, the things people believed he was capable of doing. To understand Attila, you first have to understand the world he came from. A world the Romans couldn't comprehend, and frankly didn't want to. The year is 406 AD. The Roman Empire still looks impressive on maps, but maps lie. Behind the marble facades and grand proclamations, the empire is hemorrhaging from 1,000 cuts. The borders are collapsing. Germanic tribes are pouring across the Rhine. The economy is in free fall. Corruption has become so normal that honest governance seems naive. And somewhere far to the east, beyond the edges of Roman knowledge, beyond the civilized world, something is stirring. The Huns. Romans didn't understand the Huns, and that made them even more terrifying. These weren't people who lived in cities or farmed land. They were perpetual nomads, born on horseback, living on horseback, dying on horseback. Roman historians wrote about them with a mixture of fascination and horror, describing them as barely human. Here's what made them so disturbing. The Huns practiced cranial deformation. When a child was born, they would bind the baby's skull with tight bands, forcing the bones to grow in an elongated, cone-like shape. Can you imagine seeing an army of warriors all with skulls that look alien, inhuman, like they came from somewhere else entirely? This wasn't just aesthetic, this was psychological warfare before the battle even started. When Roman soldiers saw Hunnic warriors for the first time, many thought they were facing demons, actual demons. The Huns lived on horseback to such an extreme degree that Roman writers claimed they couldn't even walk properly. They ate, slept, and negotiated treaties well mounted. They would put raw meat under their saddles and ride all day, the pressure and heat from the horse tenderizing it. By nightfall, they'd eat it raw, still warm from the horse's body. They were masters of the composite bow, a weapon that could pierce Roman armor at distances the legions had never encountered. And their tactics were revolutionary. They didn't line up for honorable combat. They swarmed, surrounded, feinted retreats to draw enemies into ambushes, and disappeared like smoke when things turned against them. To Romans who valued order, structure, and civilization, the Huns represented chaos incarnate. Into this nightmare world, Attila was born around 406 AD. Let's talk about something the legends usually gloss over. Attila's rise to power began with a murder. In 434 AD, when the previous Hunnic leader died, power was divided between two brothers, Attila and Blair. For over a decade they ruled together, launching coordinated campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire, extracting massive tributes of gold. But here's what you need to understand about Attila. He didn't just want power. He wanted absolute unquestioned power. He wanted people to think of the Huns and see only one face, his face. Around 445 AD, Bladder died under mysterious circumstances. The historical record is suspiciously silent about the details. No battle wounds are mentioned, no illness, just gone. Most historians agree. Attila killed his own brother. Think about the cold calculation required for that decision. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a man looking at his own blood relative, someone he'd ruled alongside for over a decade, and deciding he was an obstacle that needed to be removed. Did Attila poison him? Have him quietly strangled? Stage a hunting accident? We'll never know. And that's the point. Attila made sure we'd never know. What we do know is what happened next. With Bladder gone, Attila didn't just take sole control, he transformed the Hunnic Confederation into something far more terrifying. He unified the scattered tribes under one iron will. His will. And here's where Attila showed his psychological genius. When the Roman historian Priscus visited Attila's court in 448 AD, he described a scene that's incredibly revealing. At a grand banquet, Attila's guests, kings, chieftains, Roman ambassadors, ate from silver and gold plates. They drank from jeweled goblets. They wore their finest clothes, dripping with the wealth of conquest. And Attila, he sat at the head of the table, eating plain meat from a wooden plate, drinking from a wooden cup, wearing simple, clean clothes with no ornamentation whatsoever. Priscus noted that while everyone else laughed and celebrated, Attila's expression never changed. He didn't smile. He didn't make small talk. He just watched. This wasn't humility. This was dominance. Attila was showing everyone in that room that while they needed gold and silver and jewels to feel important, he didn't need anything. He was beyond such petty desires. He was the center of gravity around which everything else orbited. It's one of the most chilling power moves in history. And it worked. People who met Attila described feeling physically intimidated by a man who by all accounts was relatively short and UNR. Remarkable looking. He had a broad chest, a large head, small eyes, a thin beard. Nothing about his physical appearance was particularly imposing, but those eyes, everyone who met him mentioned the eyes. Priscus wrote that Attila could control people with a look, that he had a way of staring at someone that made them feel like he could see every secret they'd ever kept, every lie they'd ever told, every moment of weakness they'd ever experienced. Imagine having that kind of presence, the kind where you could walk into a room full of warriors and kings and without saying a word, make them all afraid of you. If you're captivated by the disturbing psychology behind history's most feared figures, hit subscribe. It helps us dig deeper into the darkness that shaped our world. Trust me, this story gets even more unsettling. Now, back to the monster. Attila's first major target was the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople, and here's where his strategy becomes truly disturbing. The Romans had a system: pay tribute to the barbarians, keep them happy, avoid war. It was expensive, but it was cheaper than fighting. So, they paid the Huns enormous amounts of gold. We're talking thousands of pounds of the stuff just to stay away. But in 441 AD, the Eastern Empire made a fatal mistake. They missed a payment. Attila didn't send a letter of complaint. He didn't open negotiations. He unleashed hell. His army swept into the Balkans like a plague. But here's what made Attila different from other barbarian raiders. This wasn't about loot. This was about sending a message. The city of Nissus was one of the first to fall. When Attila's forces breached the walls, he gave an order that would become his signature: total annihilation, not just military targets, everything. Contemporary accounts describe what happened next, and they're almost too horrific to believe. The Huns' methodi. Kali killed every living thing in the city. Men, women, children, animals, buildings were burned, wells were poisoned. The city was left as a monument to what happened when you crossed Attila. But here's the truly disturbing part. Years later, when Roman ambassadors passed through the area where Nissus once stood, they reported that they couldn't even approach the ruins. The stench of death was so overwhelming that the entire area was uninhabitable. They found the banks of the nearby river still covered with bones. Let that sink in. Years later, the smell of death was still so strong you couldn't go near it. And Nissus wasn't unique. Over 70 cities suffered the same fate: Syrica, Philippopolis, Archidopolis, each one systematically erased. The Eastern Empire was forced to negotiate. The treaty they signed in 443 AD was one of the most humiliating in Roman history. The annual tribute was tripled. Rome had to create a demilitarized zone 5 days' journey south of the Danube. Any Roman citizen who escaped to Hunnic territory had to be returned, or Rome had to pay 8 gold coins per person as compensation. But wait, it gets worse. The treaty also included a clause that if any Hunnic noble or royal family member defected to Rome, they had to be returned immediately. But Romans who defected to the Huns, they could stay. Read that again. The Roman Empire, which once dictated terms to the entire known world, was now signing treaties that treated them as inferior to nomadic horsemen. And Attila wasn't done. In 447 AD he returned. This time, his army pushed so deep into Roman territory that they reached Thermopylae, the legendary site where 300 Spartans had once held off the Persian Empire. The symbolism was crushing. The defenders of Western civilization were being pushed back through the very gates where they'd once stopped the East. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II was forced to negotiate an even more humiliating treaty. The annual tribute was raised again. Rome had to pay all the back tribute they supposedly owed, and they had to evacuate even more territory. Christian communities throughout the Eastern Empire watched this unstoppable destruction and came to a terrifying conclusion. This wasn't a military campaign. This was divine punishment. God was using Attila to punish them for their sins. They gave him a name that would echo through eternity: Fleelam Day, the Scourge of God, the Whip of God. And here's the truly chilling part. When Attila heard this title, he loved it. He started using it himself. He understood that if people believed he was an instrument of divine wrath, they'd be too terrified to resist. Why fight against God's will? It was the ultimate psychological weapon, and Attila wielded it masterfully. By 450 AD, Attila had bled the Eastern Empire white. Time to turn west, and his excuse for invasion is one of the strangest stories in history. Justa Grata Honoria was a Roman princess, sister to the Western Emperor Valentinian III. She was also, by all accounts, miserable. She'd been caught having an affair with her chamberlain, and as punishment she was being forced into an arranged marriage with a senator, a loveless political union designed to keep her under control. In her desperation, Horia did something extraordinary. She sent her ring to Attila the Hun with a letter begging him to help her escape the marriage. Now a normal person might have sent a polite letter back, maybe offered some diplomatic assistance. Attila saw an opportunity. He declared that Horia had proposed marriage to him, and as his bride, she was entitled to half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. Let's be clear, this was absurd. Everyone knew it was absurd. Honoria's letter was a plea for help, not a marriage proposal. But that didn't matter. Attila had his justification for war, and he was going to use it. When the Western Emperor refused, Attila mobilized the largest army he'd ever assembled. Contemporary sources claim 500,000 men, though modern historians think the real number was probably between 100,000 and 200,000. Still, it was massive. In 451 AD, they crossed the Rhine into Gaul. The campaign was devastating. City after city fell. Metz was completely destroyed, allegedly burned to the ground on Easter Sunday. Reims fell. Strasbourg fell. The Huns pushed deep into Gaul, and it looked like nothing could stop them. But here's where the story takes a turn. The Roman general Attus, a man who'd actually lived with the Huns as a hostage in his youth and understood how they fought, managed to forge an alliance with the Visigoths. Two enemies united by a common threat. They met Attila's forces at the Catalanian plains in June 451 AD. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest in ancient history. Ancient sources claim anywhere from 165,000 to 300,000 casualties, though modern historians think these numbers are exaggerated, but even conservative estimates put the death toll at over 50,000. Let me give you a sense of what this battlefield looked like. It wasn't like modern warfare with clean lines and clear objectives. This was a churning, chaotic mass of bodies, men hacking at each other with swords and axes, horses trampling the wounded. The Visigothic king, Theodoric I, was killed in the fighting. His body was later found trampled under the hooves of horses. The battle raged all day. As night fell, both sides were exhausted, bloodied and horrified by what they'd done to each other. Attila withdrew his forces to his camp and prepared for a last stand. According to legend, he had a funeral pile built from the saddles of horses, planning to throw himself on it, rather than be captured if the Romans breached his defenses. But the attack never came. Attas, for reasons historians still debate, didn't press the advantage. Some say he was afraid of what would happen if the Huns were completely destroyed. Better a weakened Attila than Visigoth allies who no longer needed Rome. The result was technically a draw, but strategically it was a defeat for Attila. His aura of invincibility was broken. For the first time in his career, he'd been forced to retreat. But if the Romans thought this meant Attila was finished, they were catastrophically wrong. A wounded animal is the most dangerous animal. And Attila was wounded, not in body, but in pride. In 452 AD, he invaded Italy, and this campaign was personal. Aqua was the first major target. It was one of the richest and most fortified cities in the empire. The siege lasted 3 months, and the city's defenders were confident they could hold out indefinitely. Then one day, Attila was observing the walls when he noticed storks abandoning their nests on the city's towers, flying away with their young. To Attila, this was an omen. Even the birds knew what was coming. He ordered one final massive assault. The walls were breached, and then Attila gave the order that would define this campaign. Erase it. What happened next wasn't a sacking. It was a deletion. The Huns killed systematically. Men were butchered. Women and children were enslaved or killed. Buildings were demolished, stone by stone. The wealth of the city, gold, silver, precious goods, was taken. Everything else was destroyed. When they were done, Aquileia didn't exist. Not as ruins, not as a ghost town. It was gone. Survivors fled into the marshes and lagoons of the Adriatic coast. They waded into the water, carrying what little they could save, and began building a new settlement on the islands. They drove wooden piles into the muddy bottom and built their homes on platforms above the water. They figured horsemen couldn't follow them there. They were right. That settlement would eventually become Venice, one of the world's most beautiful cities, born from absolute terror. But Attila wasn't finished. His army swept through northern Italy like a scythe. Padua fell, Verona fell, Milan fell. Each city brought more loot, more slaves, more terror. The Roman Emperor Valentinian III fled from Ravenna to Rome. The Senate met in emergency session, and they realized something horrifying. Rome had no army capable of stopping Attila. The city was completely defenseless. Imagine being a Roman citizen in that moment. Your entire civilization, everything you'd been taught to believe about Roman superiority and divine favor, was about to be tested by a short man from the steppes who ate raw meat and drank from wooden cups. The city began to panic. Rich families packed their valuables and fled south. Temples filled with people praying for divine intervention. The streets buzzed with rumors. Attila would burn the city to the ground. He would enslave everyone. He would turn Rome into another Aqua, a blank spot on the map. And then something strange happened. With no army to defend Rome, the Senate made a desperate decision. They sent a delegation to negotiate with Attila, but they didn't send a general or a politician. They sent Pope Leo I. The two men met near the Mink River in northern Italy, an elderly bishop in simple robes facing the Scourge of God. Nobody knows exactly what was said. The meeting wasn't recorded. No transcript exists. But somehow, impossibly, Leo convinced Attila to turn around and leave Italy. Christian legend has a dramatic explanation. According to the story, as Leo spoke, Saints Peter and Paul appeared in the sky behind him, holding flaming swords, threatening Attila with divine punishment if he continued. Terrified by this heavenly vision, Attila retreated. It's a beautiful story, but historians have other theories. Here's what we know. By the time Attila reached Leo, his army was in trouble. Italy had suffered a poor harvest the year before. Food was scarce. Disease was spreading through the Hun camps, probably malaria from the Italian marshes. Soldiers were dying not from Roman weapons, but from starvation and fever. On top of that, Attila had just received word that the Eastern Roman Emperor had launched a counterattack across the Danube, striking at Hunnic territory while Attila was distracted in Italy. His homeland was under threat. So maybe Leo didn't perform a miracle. Maybe he just delivered some strategic intelligence along with a promise. Leave now and Rome will pay you a massive sum of gold. Stay and watch your army disintegrate while your homeland burns. For a pragmatist like Attila, the choice might have been obvious. Or maybe, and this is the disturbing possibility, maybe Attila was playing a longer game. Maybe he understood that destroying Rome would unite the entire Christian world against him. Maybe keeping Rome terrified, but intact was more useful than reducing it to ashes. We'll never know for sure. And that ambiguity is what makes the story so powerful. Did God intervene? Did Attila have a moment of mercy, or was this just cold calculation? Whatever the truth, Attila turned his army around and left Italy. Rome was spared. Christians saw it as a miracle. Attila's reputation as an instrument of God was reinforced. Even when he showed mercy, it was because God willed it. The scourge of God had struck and then withdrawn, and somehow that made him even more terrifying. Attila never returned to Italy. In fact, he only had 1 year left to live. In 453 AD, at age 47, Attila celebrated his marriage to a young woman named Ildiko. It was another in a long line of political marriage. Attila had multiple wives, a common practice among steppe peoples to cement alliances. The wedding feast was legendary. Attila ate and drank heavily, celebrating late into the night. Eventually he retired to his chambers with his new bride. The next morning, his attendants grew worried. Attila should have emerged by dawn. He was always an early riser, but the chamber door remained closed. They knocked. No answer. They called out silence. Finally, they broke down the door. Inside, they found Attila dead. Ilda was sitting in the corner, terrified, weeping, and Attila was lying in a pool of his own blood. The official cause of death, a massive nosebleed. According to the account, Attila suffered a hemorrhage during the night, and too drunk to wake up properly, he choked on his own blood. It's one of the most anticlimactic deaths in history. The man who brought Rome to its knees, who destroyed empires, who became synonymous with apocalypse, died from a nosebleed. Of course, murder theories have circulated for 1,500 years. Was he poisoned by Ildiko? Was she an assassin sent by Roman agents? Did someone slip something into his wine during the feast? We'll never know. But here's what we do know. Attila's warriors were devastated. According to the historian Jourdain, they performed a funeral ritual so extreme it's become legendary. They cut their own faces with swords so that the greatest of all warriors should be mourned, not by the womanish tears of women, but by the blood of men. Then they held a funeral feast called a stra, days of drinking and celebrating Attila's life, and when they finally buried him, they went to extraordinary lengths to hide his grave. Legend says they buried him in a triple coffin, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron. Each layer represented the treasures he'd taken from the empires he destroyed. Then they buried the coffin in, say, Crete, possibly in a riverbed that was temporarily diverted, and to ensure the location remained secret forever, they murdered every slave who dug the grave. To this day, despite countless expeditions and millions spent searching, Attila's tomb has never been found. Attila's death was the death of the Hunnic Empire. His sons, Elac, Dengidic, and tried to divide power among themselves. It was a catastrophic mistake. The empire that Attila had held together through sheer force of will immediately began to fracture. Subjugated tribes rose up in rebellion. The Battle of Nadau in 454 AD saw Attila's own son Elac killed as Germanic tribes overthrew Hunnic dominance. Within a single year the empire was gone. The Huns who'd held the world in terror simply disappeared. They were absorbed into other tribes, scattered across the steppes, forgotten. But Attila's legacy lived on. He never conquered Rome. He never built monuments that lasted. He didn't create a civilization that endured. But in some ways, his impact was even greater than that. Attila accelerated the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Every city he destroyed weakened Rome's infrastructure. Every pound of gold he extracted drained Rome's treasury. Every humiliating treaty eroded Rome's authority. And every wave of refugees fleeing his armies crashed against Rome's borders, destabilizing everything they touched. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD, just 23 years after Attila's death, the Huns were gone, but their shadow loomed over everything. Attila perfected something darker than conquest, the weaponization of fear. He understood that reputation could be more devastating than any army, that psychological terror could accomplish what weapons alone never could. that sometimes the threat is more powerful than the action. 1,500 years later, his name is still synonymous with destruction. When we want to describe someone as barbaric, ruthless, unstoppable, we call them Attila the Hun. He lives forever in our nightmares. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all. The man is long dead, but the terror he created never died. It just waits in our collective memory, reminding us how fragile civilization really is, how quickly order can collapse into chaos, how one person with enough will and ruthlessness can bring the greatest empire in the world to its knees. Sleep well tonight, and remember, everything you consider permanent isn't. You've just witnessed how a single human being became the embodiment of apocalypse. If you want more stories that expose the terrifying fragility of everything we take for granted, subscribe to Curious Historians. Hit that notification bell because the next story we're uncovering goes even darker. We're diving into the Mongol Empire's punishment rituals that made Ayala look merciful. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and remember, history doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes.